Ever wondered what the speed limit is in Wales compared to places like Florida? Definitely you have not, but in this video you're going to find out, along with other fascinating differences, on the speed limits between the UK and the USA. Now, as we all know, a speed limit is the absolute maximum speed you are supposed to go when driving a car, though some of you disregard that, like the man who overtook me on a 60-mile-an-hour road the other day while I was going 65, but that is besides the point. I have driven in both the UK and the US, and while there are many differences in driving, we're going to narrow in on our friend, the speed limit today. Let's start with similarities though, because actually there's an important one. Both the UK and the USA are using miles per hour for speed limits. Despite the UK using the metric system for many things, they still use the imperial measurements for speed limits. They are, in fact, the only country in Europe and the Commonwealth to not use kilometers per hour, and it is against the rules to allow metric units on traffic signs in the UK when it comes to the speed limit. I've looked up the reason why this change hasn't happened, and generally the consensus is that it would basically be too difficult to change all of the signs. So this change hasn't happened and probably won't, which means the UK and the USA are on the same page for once in their history. Now, the first difference is that the UK has national speed limits, which are essentially default speed limits in many instances that apply across a whole country. Interestingly, the national speed limits are the same for England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but slightly different for Wales, which we'll get into. But the point still stands that while there is not an entire UK speed limit for every single situation, there are national speed limits broken down by country. In the US, there are currently no default national speed limits. Default speed limits are called standard speed limits, and they're down to the individual state to decide. However, this was not always the case. In 1973, as a response to the 1973 oil crisis, legislation in the US essentially required states to impose a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on all 4-lane divided highways. So because the country as a whole was demanding that the states do this, it became a national speed limit. It meant that 29 states had to lower their limits. The idea was to combat the fuel shortage, and it was one of the most unpopular laws in the US. Think of it this way. Most of the US is wide, straight roads through rural areas. So yes, going 55 miles an hour through a densely populated part of the country might not be such a big deal, but going 55 miles an hour between towns that are 100 miles apart on a straight road feels very slow. The national maximum speed limit, as it was called, was changed in the late 1980s to allow for up to 65-mile-an-hour limits, and then in 1995, Congress was like, this is a bad idea, let's scrap it, and states could then begin to set their own limits. The only other time in American history that the power to set speed limits belonged to the entire country and not to the state was during World War II, when the Office of Defense set a national maximum of 35 miles an hour, known as the Victory speed limit. This was to try and help conserve fuel and rubber for the war efforts. This was also disregarded by many and only lasted from 1942 to 1945. Now, because speed limits are set by states these days, we're going to compare the UK's national speed limits to the state limits of somewhere like Florida to give you an example. In England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the maximum speed limit in a built-up area is 30 miles an hour. In Wales, it's 20 miles an hour. So this is where the Wales difference comes in. For all countries, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, the speed limit on a single carriageway is 60 miles an hour, but 70 miles an hour on a dual carriageway or motorway, which to my American friends is a highway. This is, of course, unless otherwise signed. Now, in Florida, the standard speed limit is 20 miles an hour through a school zone, 30 miles an hour through a residential area, similar to a built-up area in the UK, and 55 on all other streets and highways, except for what are known as limited access highways, which are also called interstate highways, turnpikes, and toll roads. These are very large, multiple lane roads with no stop signs, traffic lights, railroad crossings. These are like the big roads that typically go in between states. For these in Florida, the maximum speed limit, unless otherwise posted, is 70 miles an hour. To find this out, I actually had to go back and read the Florida Driving Manual, which is a fascinating document and has a very vibrant front page that sort of feels like an album cover for a CD or like a flyer for some exciting event rather than a driving manual, but you gotta get the kids to read it somehow. Now here's an interesting comparison for the other states on the maximum speed limit for freeways. Again, that is a motorway in the UK. Texas has the road with the highest speed limit in the US at 85 miles an hour, which if you have ever driven in Texas, you'll know that basically they probably just said, you're going to go this fast anyway, so we might as well make it official. Then you've got a widespread with the majority being between 65 to 75 miles an hour. Interestingly, the 55 miles an hour to 65 miles an hour charts are filled with states like Hawaii, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Jersey, etc. These are relatively compact states, some of them, and the others have more population density. But if you keep increasing on this chart and you look at the 75 mile an hour category, you're typically looking at states that are less densely populated. So you've got like North Dakota, Nebraska, Nevada, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Wyoming, Kansas. The idea is that fewer cars on the roads in these places makes it safer to spread out and go faster, or people just want to leave these places as fast as possible. That could be it too. Another difference is in the speed limit signs, both in how they look and in the fact that America doesn't have a national speed limit or state speed limit sign like the UK does. So for my US viewers, a UK speed limit sign will look like this. But if it wants you to go the national speed limit for whatever situation you're in, then it looks like this with no number written on it. In the US, the speed limit signs look like this, and you will always find a number written on it, even when it's telling you to go whatever the state speed limit is. This is why I didn't remember the Florida standard speed limits, because unlike in the UK where you actually need to know what they are in case you encounter the national speed limit sign, signs in the US will just tell you what it is anyway, so there's no confusion. Part of this as well has to do with the fact that the standard speed limits, as I mentioned, are down to the states. Americans love a road trip, number one. Number two, especially in places like the Northeast, you could be passing through like multiple states in one day. So to remember all of the different standard speed limits per state would be a little bit difficult, so they just write it down anyway. Another thing I've noticed just culturally is that often UK roads are signposted for a speed that would probably be unsafe if you took the entire road at that speed. You're expected to know that this is the absolute maximum and you need to slow yourself down if the road narrows or is filled with a lot of bends. The speed limit won't necessarily change, but it really gives the responsibility to the driver to adjust and navigate their speed appropriately. In the US, you'll find that usually the speed limit keeps changing a lot according to the road, putting less responsibility on the driver to know what's going on. But what about speeding? Do people generally stick to the limits or do they go over? This is hard to quantify, though I would say the general culture in the US is usually to go about 5 miles an hour over the posted speed limit. At 10 over, you're pushing it and could definitely be pulled over. In the UK, I've noticed that of course some people do go a bit above the speed limit. However, I feel like more people in the UK will stick to the actual speed limit. However, I don't think this is because the UK citizens are necessarily more law-abiding, but actually, in fact, there are a lot more speed cameras in the UK than in the US. So people are actually more at risk of being caught speeding in the UK, even if not by a police officer. In the US, there are far, far fewer speed cameras, but many more police officers looking out for speeding. So it's more common in the US than in the UK, in my experience, to be pulled over by a police officer in America for the act of speeding. So instead of the speed camera doing the work, the police officer would do it. And of course, there are conspiracies within American neighborhoods and towns that police officers who need to reach their quota to give out tickets will start keeping a better eye out for speeders towards the end of their quota period. I am not validating the accuracy of this claim, and in fact, it is technically illegal in many states for police to have ticket quotas, but someone put it this way, which I thought was a good way to put it. They said, any workplace, law enforcement, or otherwise will have productivity goals. If you don't complete as many work tasks as your peers or compared to your previous work activity, you'll probably hear about it from your boss at some point. And if you can't keep up with the goals, then you'll find yourself on the outs with your boss and your team. The police operate in the same manner. So while there are not technically ticket quotas, there could be something to be said for different reasons why during different periods of the year or different pushes within the police force, you might get more or fewer tickets in an area in the US. And again, this is different from the UK, where I feel like speeding is mostly patrolled by speed cameras, which are operating usually all of the time on the same road. And the speed camera just captures what it is. If you're over, you're over. If you're not, you're not. Now this brings us to the end of today's video. As always, I hope you learned something new, and leave all of your comments on the thought below. I'm sure none of you speed and I'll go the exact speed limit you're supposed to at all times, but leave your experiences down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.